Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deepan Shah. I'm the head of cardiac MRI and the head of cardiac imaging at Houston Methodist. And today I'm going to talk about basic principles of cardiac MRI. And then obviously throughout these sessions for the rest of the academic year, we'll continue to talk about specific clinical applications. So I want to keep this a little bit interactive as well. With some of our fellows that are here. First off, here's an MRI scanner. So this was actually, we don't have this scanner any longer. This was the first scanner that we got when I first started here at Houston Methodist with the CMR program in 2008. And this was a Magnetome Avanto scanner, which was a 1.5 Tesla scanner. Most of you know what an MRI scanner looks like. It's this kind of circular machine. People like to think of it as like a donut. Like tube with a table. So the patient lays on the table here. This table then goes up and then goes into the bore of the scanner itself. So a couple of things I think with MRI. One is you're able to, it's a non-invasive technique, doesn't require any ionizing radiation, but it uses high magnetic fields. So that's the approach that's used to actually generate the images. So, and then obviously these are just a variety of different images that you can generate, showing really that there's a variety of different applications you can use cardiac MRI for, whether it's for valvular heart disease assessment to measure flows, cardiac masses, to do stress perfusion for looking for coronary ischemic heart disease, cardiomyopathies like RV dysplasia, ischemic heart disease, pericardial disease, and then also aortic disease. So first off, who are these two gentlemen right here? So this is Paul Lauterberg and Peter Mansfield. So these are two PhD scientists in the United Kingdom that actually received the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine for their discoveries regarding magnetic resonance imaging. Now, this is just to give you an idea of, people always say that with research, the payoff comes down the road later. These gentlemen, they were working on this stuff in the 60s and 70s, right? And their first MRI image that they generated was actually just a cross-sectional image of a finger, which took 5 minutes to acquire. And this, I believe, was in the late 1970s or so. And then obviously the Nobel Prize came a few years later. So you have to be patient. But obviously I think, MRI imaging has certainly transformed the way that we transform medicine And cardiac imaging, I think, came later, and it really has had a significant impact on cardiac MRI imaging. So I kind of gave away the answer here. But let me see. When was that first MRI exam in a human subject performed? Again, 5 minutes to generate one cross-sectional imaging of the finger. 1969, 1981, or 1980, or 1977? 77. So if you were listening, you notice I said it was in the 70s, so it was 1977 is absolutely right. So oftentimes the answers to the test are given to you, so always pay careful attention. So here's the next question, which I haven't given you the answer to yet, which is for MRI imaging, what is the element that's the most important in the human body? Is it oxygen, hydrogen, or carbon?
Hydrogen.
Okay, so that's great. So everyone got that right. And in fact, hydrogen is, now you can do MRI imaging with other elements as well, but hydrogen is the one that we use predominantly for clinical imaging. And part of the reason for that is because, guess what? The body is made up of almost 2/3 water, and water is hydrogen atoms, right? So you get the best signal if you do hydrogen-based imaging, and that's why most MRI imaging is done with hydrogen or proton imaging, as we call it. And so really there's two basic principles. So we talked about the fact that you have a magnet, right? That's your MRI scanner, which has a strong magnetic field. And then we'll also talk about these radio waves that are being transmitted and received. And it's these two pieces right here that allow you to generate an image, right? So in the end, the basic things that you need is just a magnet and the ability to transmit and receive radio waves. And then there's many other steps along the way, but these basic building blocks allow you to be able to generate an MRI image. So what we're going to touch on is some of the basics of MRI physics, talk about MRI safety. We'll touch a little bit on implanted devices. So for you, for the fellows especially, this is important to know. If you're seeing patients in the hospital and considering getting an MRI scan, to say, how do I screen these patients? We'll talk a little about gadolinium contrast. And then, again, clinical applications is what we're going to be talking about throughout the course of the year. So this is one I'll say stay tuned for as we go. So first off, let's go back to that MRI scanner that I showed you before, and really kind of distill it down to the individual components. So obviously the patient table and then the MRI system itself. Now the MRI system itself really has three key components to it. There's the main magnet coils, there's the gradient coils, and then there's the radio frequency coils. So the main magnet coils are what give it the magnetic field, okay? And then the gradient coils, what they do, and again, those are built into the magnet itself, they cause a slight alteration in the magnetic field locally. And we'll talk about this in more detail to explain what that means. And then lastly, these radio frequency coils, there's radio frequency coils that are built in to the magnet itself. And then there's also surface coils that we may utilize, which you put on top of the patient. So you put on top of the chest, or you may have it in the table itself, what we call spine coils, which again allow you to transmit and receive radio waves. Okay, so here's a question. What are the typical magnetic field strengths that are used in clinical MRI scanners? Let me see, I think I've got the answer. 1.5 Tesla, 3 Tesla, 0.5 Tesla, 7 Tesla. Which ones are they?
1.5 and 3.
Yeah, so most clinical imaging is 1.5 and 3 Tesla. There are now newer systems that are actually 0.5 Tesla. So these are very low field strength. And in fact, there is now a 7 Tesla scanner that is FDA approved, not for cardiac, mainly for neuro or body applications, but there is a 7 Tesla that's clinical scanner as well. And this actually was the picture of the 7 Tesla scanner when it was going in our research institute a few years ago. There are other scanners. There's actually 9 Tesla, even 11 Tesla. I think they go up as high as 15 Tesla, but those are very small bore, so those are mainly for animal or ex vivo tissue type imaging. But again, for humans, these are the field strengths that are currently FDA approved. And again, most cardiac is done at 1.5 or 3 Tesla. There's a few sites that are doing cardiac at a very low field strength of 0.5. And really, 0.7 Tesla for cardiac is purely for research purposes. Yep, so yes?
Does this strength dictate in terms of imaging quality, or is it independent of
So
that?
that's a great question, and we'll talk about that. So that's coming up, so I think you set it up very nicely. Okay, so so we talked about, again, the Tesla or the strength. Just to give you a frame of reference, right, 1 Tesla is equal to about 20,000 times the Earth's magnetic field. So all of you know, right, if you've ever gone camping and you had a compass with you, right, it has a magnet, and it allows you to be able to know what's north and south. That's based on the Earth's magnetic field. So, so we have a scanner that's a 1.5 Tesla scanner. That actually means it's about 30,000 times the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. So it's a very strong magnet. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the gradient coils. And so the gradient coils actually can exist in 3 different axes. They're in the X, Y, and Z axes, right? And the reason for that is that allows you then to be able to pick any imaging plane that you want to with the use of those 3 gradient coils. Now, a couple of parameters that I'm going to tell you about, which is what is the strength of your gradient coils? And this basically is the steepness of the slope of your gradients. So how much of an alteration in the magnetic field can you achieve? And so the idea being that if I have a gradient that's in the head to foot direction, that gradient will then cause a slight alteration in the magnetic field. So if at the very center of the scanner, which we call isocenter, it's 1.5 Tesla, by applying a gradient, I could make the magnetization a little bit higher, for example, maybe 1.5001 Tesla, and I go further towards the head, and make it a little bit lower, like 1.4999 as I go further towards the feet. And it progressively gets either higher or lower. Again, these are small magnitudes of changes, but as you'll see, these small magnitudes of changes are part of what allows you to be able to do imaging. The other parameter that oftentimes will be reported on is what's called the slew rate, which is how fast you can achieve that gradient, how fast you can achieve that alteration. And again, this becomes very important for especially cardiac imaging, where speed is important. Not only do you want to achieve an alteration in the local magnetization, but the quicker you can achieve that, the faster your imaging can be. Now, there's trade-offs, though, because obviously if you have a very steep gradient and you do it very fast, what's the risk? Well, the risk is you can get peripheral nerve stimulation, right? Again, at the edges, right? So furthest away, so towards the foot or towards the head. So, it's not one of those things where you just make it as high as physically possible. You have to balance all of these things. The other advantage that the gradients allow you to achieve is to actually have a reference coordinate system. So this, I think, is one of the unique aspects when you talk about tomographic imaging, so MRI and CT, where you're not just getting a particular plane, you can get a pre-specified plane, and you can get sequential images one after another. So the gradients allow you to be able to do that. And then the last thing is the radio frequency coils, which again, there's radio frequency coils that are within the magnet itself, but then there's also coils that oftentimes you can put on the body, which become very close to the tissue that you're imaging. And the purpose of these radio frequency coils are, again, to transmit as well as receive radio waves. All right, and so this is an example. Now this is a patient, if you want to do kind of total body imaging, where it's almost like a full metal jacket, right? Where you've got a head coil that's put here, and then you've got surface coils all along from the chest, the abdomen, and the legs, right? And again, where would you do this much would be if you want to do like a vascular study where you want to go from carotid down to toe or something. But again, for most cardiac imaging, you don't really need this head coil. You don't need all of these coils in the legs. All you really need is just this surface coil right here over the chest. And then recognize in the table itself, there's a coil, what we call the spine coil. So now you've got 2 coils that are close to the heart. One is anterior, one is posterior, and that allows you to get the best signal. Okay, so we talked about the hardware. Let's talk about this concept of MRI spins, all right? And the idea is if you have a glass of water, all right, and it has no magnetic field, then the water or the protons are going to be just randomly spinning around, right? Now what happens when I apply a magnetic field, it causes then everything to align in the direction of the magnetic field. And so as a result then, it doesn't mean that every single water molecule, every single proton is lined up positive if my magnetic field here is in this positive direction. It means that there's a net positive signal, right? There's still some that are going to be anti-parallel and some that are going to be parallel, but there'll be more that are parallel, aligned with the magnetic field than that are inverted. And it's the net that you get here, that's the net alignment that you're able to achieve. Now, the amount of protons that are aligned in the positive direction with the magnetic field, that's directly related to the strength of the magnetic field. So a stronger field strength means you have more protons that are aligned in the positive direction. To give you an idea, just of as a kind of just a rough number, right? If you have a 1 Tesla magnetic field, that means that you may have 2 or 3 more protons per million aligned positive versus negative, right? So again, it's not like every single one, but it's that there's a net positive or net negative, and there's a net amount in a certain value. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, so the protons can either be spinning around upright or inverted, right? But they align with the magnetic field. The other thing to recognize is when they're inverted, that's a high energy state. When they're aligned parallel with the magnetic field, that's the low energy state. So that's the resting state, again, is that more protons will be lined in the low energy state. I'll skip past this here because we talked about this already. And so again, this is giving an example. The patient, when they're outside the scanner, there's no net magnetization of the body tissue. Once they go inside the scanner, then the tissue achieves the same net magnetization as the strength of your scanner. So if it's a 1.5 Tesla scanner, then inside the magnet now, your tissue, your human tissue will be lined with the magnetic field and therefore have a local magnetization of 1.5 Tesla. Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that these protons, they're spinning around. And what's the frequency that they spin around at? That's called the precession frequency. All right. So again, sometimes there's just some names that you just have to memorize what they are. And the precession frequency is the speed with which something is spinning around. Now, that's a predictable frequency. All right. And it's based on this equation right here, which is what's called the Larmor equation. So this is the type of thing that for any of the imaging fellows, if you're going to take the MRI board exam, they love to ask this question. So make sure you memorize this, right? The Larmor equation, which really says that protons, when they're in a magnetic field, the frequency that they're going to spin at equals the local magnetic field, so whatever the magnetic field strength is locally, times a ratio, which is called a Gauss-magnetic ratio. So that ratio will differ depending upon if it's hydrogen versus carbon versus oxygen or anything else. But for hydrogen, which again is what we do most of our imaging in, is 42 millitesla per meter. 42 millihertz per Tesla. So therefore, if you place a patient inside a 1.5 Tesla scanner, then the protons will be spinning around at what frequency? So again, go to this Larmor equation and somebody do the math and tell me what it is. Was that?
42?
Well, so it's 1.5 Tesla.
42 times 1.5?
Right, that's it. 42 times 1.5, which is about 64 megahertz, right? So at 3 Tesla, what are the protons spinning around at?
126.
Yeah, about 128, right? So again, this gives you an idea of the frequency. And in fact, look, the answer is there on the slide as well, right? See? 64 megahertz at 1.5 Tesla, 128 megahertz at 3 Tesla. Now, if you go to 7 Tesla, it's going to be even faster, right? So the protons will be spinning around, and at 0.5 Tesla, the protons are spinning around at a lower field strength. Yep.
Is there any harmful effect of 10 Tesla versus 3 Tesla?
Yes, so that's a good question. Obviously, to answer your question, let me put it this way. There's not been lots of, let's say, outcome study to say, okay, what happens if I keep you in a 10 Tesla scanner for a prolonged period of time? What you can notice is that, for example, in some of these very, very high field strength scanners, when patients go inside, they oftentimes will notice they feel a little dizzy or woozy. Okay, so again, is that a long-term effect? We don't know. I don't think so. But again, when you have all of your protons that speed up, that align a certain way, a larger number, that certainly may have some local transient effects. right? So that's one of the things certainly to be aware of. And so, again, that's another reason why you're not going to ever see a 100 Tesla scanner. I mean, I think there's some physiologic limits that exist. But certainly with the clinical ones that we use today, 1.5 and 3T, I don't think there's a difference, okay? So now, okay, so we talked about the spins, which is, again, it's the protons that are spinning around. Now let's talk about MRI excitation, okay? And so the concept of excitation is, we said that if the protons are in the resting state inside of a magnetic field, the net vector is upright and spinning around. Now, if I apply a radio frequency pulse, then that will cause those protons to absorb that energy and then to move to a different energy state, okay? To a higher energy state, which means that they get tipped down, okay? Now, the amount and duration of this radio frequency pulse that you apply determines how much they get tipped down. So again, this is the net magnetization vector, goes from the upright to, if I apply a 30-degree pulse, then that vector gets shifted by 30 degrees. If you apply a 90-degree pulse, then that vector would get shifted by 90 degrees. So now all of your magnetization would go from the longitudinal plane, which is upright, into the transverse plane, right? And if you did a 180, what happens? It goes all the way down to the bottom, right? So again, depending upon the radio frequency pulse that you applied, you cause the protons to go to a different excited state. And then it's predictable, though, how much you cause them to shift, and that's based on the amount, the amplitude, and the duration of the radio frequency waves that you transmit, okay? So we'll come back to that concept in a second, but the basic principle is that the first step in doing anything in MRI is by sending in radio waves that cause the protons to get excited, okay? And that means that basically you're causing it to go from being in the longitudinal plane to some component that gets driven into the transverse plane. All right. Now, so if you apply 90, I said that causes the protons to go completely from longitudinal all the way to the transverse plane. Now, remember, as we talked about, in the longitudinal plane, they're spinning around. Even though you tip them 90 degrees to the transverse plane, they'll still keep spinning around. Okay? So the protons are always going to keep spinning around if they're faced with a magnetic field. But the 90 is really the one that gives you the highest MR signal, because the signal that you receive is based on the magnetization that's in the transverse plane. So the idea is the resting is longitudinal or upright. Whatever you shift into the transverse plane, that's what's going to give you the MR signal. Okay? We'll talk about how you get the MR signal in a second. But so this is just an example showing you how this works. So let this start over again. Notice protons are upright. There's a radio frequency wave that's applied that causes them to shift down into the transverse plane or 90 degrees. And then they continue to keep spinning around when they're in the transverse plane as well. Now, what happens is, and this is, how many of you have heard this concept T1 or T2?
T2 star.
Right, everyone's heard of that, and then there's T2 star as well, right? So everyone's heard of this term. What does it mean, right? So let me kind of go through and explain to you what it means. And again, like I said, just bear with me for like the next 10 or 15 minutes. We'll get through some of the basic physics stuff, and then it'll get better, okay? So, but you have to do. It's always you gotta eat your vegetables first before you get the dessert, okay? So, what is MR relaxation? All right, so it's not me going on the beach and it's not the MRI cardiologist going on the beach. That's not what relaxation is. It's the property of hydrogen atoms, which is that if you cause them to leave the low energy resting state, which again is the upright state, they'll eventually try to get back to that state again, right? Because again, if you put something into a high energy state, it's going to try to go back to the low energy state or the resting state. And so if I look at the top here, if you apply 90-degree pulse, right, all of your protons, instead of being upright, they're all in the horizontal or transverse plane. They're spinning around. But what will happen is they'll eventually try to regrow that longitudinal magnetization, all right? So again, going back to that resting state. And as they do that, they'll actually transmit a signal back as well. But the speed which this longitudinal signal or magnetization is regrown, that's what your T1 is. So again, T1 you can think of as, if I knock somebody down, just think of it as like a person. You knock them down like a boxer, right? How fast does a guy get back up, okay? And that's tissue dependent, okay? So different tissues have different T1 relaxation time, just like you can think of it, a champion boxer is going to get back up much faster than, let's say, one of us who gets knocked down. It's going to take us longer time to get back up. So, and in fact, this also is a type of question that the MRI boards would love to ask, which is, what is the specific definition of a T1 time? It's the amount of time it takes. If you knock it down, so you knock that boxer down, how long does it take for it to regain 63% of the magnetization? Okay? So again, if it goes back fully, that's 100% regrowth. But the time at which 63% is regrown, that's a T1 time constant. Okay? That's, again, specific for each individual tissue. And to give you an idea, let me see. This is actually showing you the T1 recovery curves for different tissue. Now, you'll notice here, fat is this curve right here, which has the fastest T1 recovery, right? You can see this, once you take the magnetization from the resting state to 0, right, how fast does it regrow? Well, the amount of time it takes for fat to get back to 63% is about 240 milliseconds. So that's the T1 time for fat. Now, what's the slowest is water, right? So water has very slow T1 recovery time. And in fact, if you map it out here, for water to regrow back to that, again, that 63%, it's about 2,000 milliseconds, so about 2 to 2.5 seconds, okay? And then other tissues have different values in between that, all right? So that's a T1 recovery. The next thing we're going to talk about is T2. Okay, so T2 is the decay, all right? And so the idea here again is, if you think of it as if you knock everything down into the transverse plane, those protons are all spinning around together, but eventually they'll start to separate away from each other, all right? And a simple analogy I can give you to think about this is, if you go to that the Rice track and field, right? And you have a bunch of people that are out there. At the start of the finish line, if you're looking up from the sky, you see a big blob of people that are all running around together, right? And then what happens over time, some are faster, some are slower, and as a result, the size of your big blob where the mass of people are gets less and less and less, because a few get ahead of the crowd, a few get further behind the crowd. And that's what you're seeing here is what happens to your T2 signal is it gradually decays over time, all right? And so this is now going to be a schematic that shows that. So you see we knocked everything down into the transverse plane with a 90-degree pulse, and notice what happens, these things start to separate from each other. So then if you take the net vector, right, which is summate all of these together, the net size of the vector gets less and less and less. And that's your T2 decay. So your T2 decay also is tissue dependent. So this is showing you again what happens when you apply 90-degree pulse. Initially, all the protons are spinning around together, so you have a very high transverse signal because they're all aligned. And then over time, they start to get misaligned, and then eventually they're all completely randomly distributed across, so they're completely all separate from each other, and then your net vector becomes 0. So this is the rate of your T2 signal loss, or your T2 vector loss. And again, the T2 time is basically the amount of time that it takes to lose or drop down to 37%. Okay, so T1 is the amount of time it takes to get back to 63% of the full magnetization. T2 is the amount of time it takes to decay away down to 37%. So these are just kind of conventions that you need to understand. It's not 90% recovery or 90% loss. It's defined as 63% recovery or 37% loss, or decay down to 37%. So the T2 time also is tissue specific. And so remember we said water has the slowest T1 recovery time. It also has the longest T2 decay time. So the T2 decay time, again, for water, for it to get down to 37% is almost 1,500 milliseconds, right? Whereas something like fat will have a faster T2 decay time as well. So the T2 time for fat is shorter. Okay, so far what have we, and then part of it is now, if you do your imaging with a certain set of parameters, you can then, for the exact same imaging plane, you can then make things appear different, right? Based on what I have on the left-hand side is a sequence that's a T1 weighted sequence. So that's a sequence that's designed in such a way that things that have short T1 recovery times have high signal, like fat, and things that have long T1 recovery times, like water in this pericardial cyst here, have low signal. And then that same imaging plane, I can make the image look very different if I do a T2 weighted sequence, where in this case, something that has a very slow T2 decay time, like water, will have high signal, right? So again, if I show you an image and say, okay, tell me what the tissue is or characterize this tissue, you can't do that unless you know what sequence it is. So is it a T1 weighted image? Is it a T2 weighted image? I mean, the reality is, for those of us that are in the lab, just by looking at the characteristics of the image, I can just tell this is a T1 weighted image. Because I know, for example, this, what's out here outside the chest wall is fat. And if I see a sequence that makes the fat appear bright, that's probably a T1 weighted image, right? So, but you need to really know what sequence it is that you're doing, because again, you can make the exact same object appear very different. You can make it appear bright, gray, or black, depending upon the specific sequence that you utilize. Okay, so 2 more basic physics parts, and then we'll get to some better stuff, okay? So the last 2 pieces is how do you actually make the image itself? And there's 3 components to this. There's 3 steps. One is to select a slice that you're interested in. So from a clinical application standpoint, how do you do that? Well, the technologist just simply places a cursor, right? It's just a user interface on a computer, and you just say, okay, give me a plane that's right here, or I can put the cursor lower down if I want to do the belly, or if I want to do the head. So it's just moving a mouse and moving a cursor, but that allows you to be able to select a particular slice of interest. And the reason that the scanner is able to select that slice of interest is, again, by this concept of when you apply a gradient, right, which again is the first step we talked about, is you put the patient into a magnet where they're now, the body tissue is facing a certain magnetic field. Applying a gradient in this head to foot direction will cause the protons in the further away from your center to be spinning slightly faster, because the magnetization is a little bit higher as you go further up, right? That's what this line right here represents. And then on the bottom side, as you go further down towards the feet, the magnetization is a little bit lower and lower and lower, and therefore the precession frequency will be a little bit less and less and less. So at the center, at a 1.5 Tesla, it'll be 64 megahertz. Every centimeter that you go closer to the head, in this example case, the frequency will be a little bit higher than 64, and every centimeter that you go towards the foot, the frequency will be a little bit lower than 64 megahertz. And if I know that, now I can say, okay, if I want to image at the head, then at this location, again, if I just map it out, I need the protons here maybe are spinning at 64.5 megahertz. So therefore, if I send a radio frequency wave at 64.5 megahertz, then only the protons in that slice will get excited, right? So an example of this is, you can think about it as like if for those of you who have kids, right, if they're on a swing and they're swinging back and forth, and if you're just randomly pushing, you're not going to make contact, and you're not going to make them go any faster, right? So you have to synchronize the way that you're pushing to synchronize with the speed, the frequency with which the swing is going back and forth. So if you time it so that the swing comes back, and then you push, that signal or that energy from your push gets transmitted to the swing, and your child goes faster, right? So only the frequencies that you transmit that are equivalent to the frequency that the protons are spinning at will get excited, will receive that signal, right? So in essence, that's a way that you do slice selection. So now the last 2 are a little bit more complicated, which is there's what's called a phase encoding gradient that's also applied. So if we talked about the first one in the z-axis, this you can think of as in the x-axis, and this causes the protons to rotate at slightly different frequencies. So an example here would be that if I apply different phase encode steps, the protons become more and more misaligned with each other, and as a result, there's what's called a net phase shift, okay? And that net phase shift allows me to localize, is this higher up on my grid, or is this lower down, right? And this is kind of the basic concept by which it localizes where it is. And then the last piece is the signal that comes back is going to be based on a certain frequency based on a third gradient, which is in the frequency direction, and that allows me to then localize it now in the x and y planes. So notice I only excite the z-axis, which is one particular slice, And then I then start applying different gradients, which allow me to then localize where it is. So, and that is collecting a series of information called phase and frequency, or phase and read steps. Okay? So the final piece of this now is, if I collect the information on phase and frequency, that's what's called K-space. There's a transformation that can occur mathematically called a Fourier transformation. So again, for those of you that are imaging fellows, the boards will love to ask this question, which is, what is a Fourier transformation? It's really taking sampling information about phase and frequency and then converting it in such a way that you actually generate the image itself. A couple of key principles to keep in mind. Again, we're almost done with the physics part. So this is like, you can think of it as like it's the bottom of the ninth inning here. Just hang in there with me. Which is that the information that you obtain, which again, this right here is kind of our full K-space, okay? Think of it, there's two components. There's the center of the K-space, and then there's the periphery of the K-space. Now, every line of K-space somehow contributes to the image. So if I only sample, for example, the top half of K-space, I can still generate an image. If I only sample the very center of K-space, I can still generate an image, but it looks different, right? So here's my image where I have the full, all lines of K-space. Here's my image if I reconstruct with only the center of K-space. And here's an image if I get rid of the center and only have the periphery. So what do you notice is different about these two images here? Well, the center lines give you information about image intensity. So that's why you notice in this image here, I have brights and darks, but I don't have sharp borders, right? Whereas the peripheral lines of K-space give you information about the borders or the edges, but it doesn't give you any information about differences in image intensity. So obviously you want both, but you also want to recognize that if you time when you're acquiring the center lines versus the peripheral lines, that can create different types of image for you. And this is partly what you use for MR angiography, for example, where you say, hey, I want to see the artery, but I don't want to see the vein. So how can I get rid of the venous signal altogether? Well, if I sample my acquisition such that the center of K-space is acquired when the contrast is in the artery, but there's no contrast in the vein, then I don't see the vein at all, right? So that's a way to basically suppress all the other background signal except for what's in your artery itself. All right, and so again, these are concepts that we'll touch on as we go throughout the year, but the idea is you use these basic physics principles to actually allow you to be able to generate a variety of different images, and there's many more steps involved. Okay, so that's it. We're done with the physics part. So now let's take a sigh of relief. Why is understanding some of this stuff important? So, you might say, okay, I'm a general cardiology fellow. What do I need to know about MRI imaging? All right, the reality is, imaging is a key component of what you're going to do as far as managing your patients, even if you say, I'm going to be a general cardiologist or an interventionalist or an EP. And this actually is just a recent publication that showed the rate of cardiac imaging procedures that are done in Medicare patients. Because again, a lot of studies are done in Medicare patients because this information is all publicly reported. So you can see over the last decade, so this is data from 2010 to 2019, there was almost a 125% increase in the amount of cardiac MRI studies that were done, right? So you can see echo was relatively flat. Nuclear actually had a decline over that 10-year period. But it's the advanced imaging modalities, which obviously are starting from a lower base, but those are the ones where there's an increase in the amount of utilization with PET, CT, and MRI all showing close to 100+% increase over that decade. All right, so the reality is, and again, these numbers, these curves haven't changed. So if you extrapolate this out to 2024, the numbers are going to be even higher than what they were before. So again, this is important for you to understand, even as a general cardiologist, because you're going to want to order these tests, and so you want to know how these tests work to some extent. Okay, a couple more things I want to touch on. One is the concept of safety, MRI safety. So this is not from here, okay? This is from somewhere else. I found this on the internet. The idea is this is a magnet, right? It's a very strong magnet. What happens with a magnet, right? If you ever taken a magnet, put it near a metallic object, it pulls it, right? And what happens actually is as the object gets closer and closer to the magnetic field gets even stronger and stronger and stronger exponentially. So this is an example. Somebody, I don't know where, not here though, decided to take this bed in so that, into the magnet rooms. They probably thought, I'm bringing a patient here, or I'm going to bring this bed here, and then I don't know what they were thinking, but obviously you can see this bed has lots of metallic components to it. Those metallic components get pulled towards the magnetic field and becomes a projectile, and it becomes impossible to remove this thing, right? Because it's such a strong magnetic field, nobody's physically strong enough to remove it, right? So you actually have to take this scanner, turn the magnetic field off, right? Now the problem is it's not like turning it off is just putting a button. It's not like an on-off switch, right? There's a huge step to turn it off, and then to turn it back on again will take 3 weeks, okay? So the magnet is always on. So if you go to the MRI suite, it's Sunday night, all the lights are out, the computer console is turned off, the magnet is still on, okay? So the reason I say this is important is for you guys, you get called because there's a cardiac arrest happening in the MRI suite. Well, you do not go into the room, okay? Do not go into the room. You instead ask the MRI team to bring the patient out of the room. And the reason is, what do you have? You probably have a stethoscope. Guess what? This right here becomes a projectile. It can do a lot of damage, okay? There's been cases of people that, there was a patient on the table, they took an oxygen tubing in because the patient was short of breath. That oxygen tank became a projectile and killed the patient, right? So bottom line is, if you get called for a cardiac arrest, you do not go into the magnet room. What we tell all of our MRI staff is, if you have a patient that's crashing, what you do before you even begin any CPR is take them out of the room, right? You take them to the holding area, and then you do everything you need to do. But you do not let the code team go into the MRI room because it'll be a disaster. Okay, so a couple other things about MRI safety. So this is, again, for those imaging fellows that are going to take the boards, they love to ask you these questions as well. So this is just a nomenclature. The American College of Radiology has come up with a safety nomenclature. So there's zones of safety, okay? So zone 1 is basically the entrance to the MRI facility. So anybody can be there, all right? That's where the general public shows up at your door and says, hey, I'm here for an MRI scan, or I'm bringing my parents to come and get an MRI scan. Zone 2 now is a somewhat controlled area. So that can also be the reception, and that can be the patient dressing area. It's in zone 2 where we do the screening. So we go through with a series of questionnaire to say, okay, do you have any metal? Do you have a pacemaker, defibrillator? Do you have any shrapnel? Do you have any bullets? It doesn't mean that all of these things are contraindications to doing an MRI, but it means you need to know about these things, and then we have strategies for which we can work around them. So again, the reception area or the patient holding area, that's classified as zone 2. That's where the screening can happen. And then you've got zone 3 and zone 4. Nobody should go into zone 3 or zone 4 until they've been screened. So therefore that means if any of you get called for cardiac arrest, you can go to the zone 2, which is the holding area, but you should not go into the control room or into the magnet room, okay? And then zone 3, this is the control room. So this is, for those of you that have seen an MRI suite, this is basically the room that's outside of where the magnet is. So the magnet room is zone 4. Okay, that's the most controlled environment. Zone 3 is where the technologists have the computer and that they're actually doing the scan, all right? And so oftentimes the reading room may be here. Oftentimes the reading room will be in zone 2. And then these areas are all access controlled as well. So you usually have to have a badge or a keypad. It's not just wide open, okay? Nobody can just automatically go in and out because you don't want somebody just drifting in from the street into a zone 3 or zone 4, okay? Because your MRI facility will be closed down if that happens. All right.
Are these lead doors between the zones?
Yeah, so yeah, these are specially shielded doors. And there's two purposes. One is to try to reduce the magnetic field, but also importantly is to prevent radio waves from going in and out. Right? Because remember we talked about earlier, the radio waves is how you transmit and receive signal. So you don't want radio waves from your phone or from a radio station corrupting your image. So that's why there's a special shielding that's done for these rooms to prevent radio waves from going in and out. Okay. Yeah, so it's not lead. It's a slightly different type of shielding, but there's a special shielding that's in place. Okay, so we talked about this already, which is if there's an emergency in the MRI scanner, take the patient out of the scanner room, out of the control room, put them in the holding area, which is now zone 2, and then you can meet the code team and you can do everything that needs to get done. Okay, the other question people always ask me is, oh, I've got a device, is it MRI safe? Okay, well, so they used to use this term MRI safe and unsafe. That's not the terminology we use anymore. So instead now what the FDA uses is MRI unsafe, MRI conditional, MRI safe. Now, MRI safe is something that has no magnetic components to it at all. No metallic components, okay? So therefore, that'd be like a plastic Petri dish, okay? Like even your pen may not be considered MRI safe because there may be some metallic components within it, right? But if you have a Petri dish or something that's just plastic, you can say, yes, that's MRI safe, which means you can take it inside any MRI environment you want, no problem. MRI unsafe is that bed I showed you. That was clearly MRI unsafe, right? And in the MRI suite, most of the things are labeled. There's a sticker on them, like if you got the garbage bag for putting the gowns, right? It'll have a label on it, whether it's MRI unsafe, safe, or conditional, okay? Based again on what the components are. Most objects, notice why this is the biggest here, because most of the objects that we're dealing with are what we call conditional. And what that means is that there's no known hazards in a specified MRI environment with specified conditions of use, right? So in other words, you don't go cavalier and say, oh, this pacemaker is now MRI safe. We call it MRI conditional, and that means that within a certain set of conditions, it's considered to be acceptable, okay? That doesn't mean, though, if you take that same device and put it to your 7 Tesla scanner, that may no longer be MRI safe, MRI conditional, right? And I'm going to go over this in a second here. This actually was the first MRI conditional pacemaker that was FDA approved. What are the issues that you worry about when you take patients with devices into an MRI environment? And there's a few different things that you worry about. One is, what is the effect of the magnetic field on your device? So could it cause the device to move, to migrate? What is the, so that's the mechanical effect or movement, okay? The other is, what about heating? Because if you have metal, that metal may absorb those radio frequency waves that you're transmitting, and could that then cause the tissue next to your metallic object to heat up? So could there be thermal injury or tissue injury? And then the other is kind of electromagnetic effects, which is interactions between electrical fields, okay? So to kind of address the question of scanning patients with devices, there's actually been now, obviously there's devices that are already FDA conditional that have been tested and FDA labeled. These are 2 studies that came out both in 2017, which looked at large series of patients with the legacy devices. So these are devices that were put into patients before the whole MRI conditional devices came along to say, okay, can these devices be safely done? And again, using a preset set of programming approach, these 2 studies demonstrated, in fact, that it may be reasonable to be able to scan even the legacy devices as well. And so where we are today now, so I'm going to skip forward now to say here's what our current state is, which is that nowadays most devices, whether they're labeled as MRI conditional or not, we have enough experience that we can do most pacemakers, defibrillators. But again, we have, a pre-specified way that we interrogate the device, reprogram the device, and then do the scan in a certain set of conditions. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of, and I'm going to take you back. How many of you have been to Vegas, Las Vegas? Nobody? Okay. Only like 4 or 5 people, really? Or you just don't want to admit it? Okay. Well, have you ever been to, there's a hotel called the Vdara Hotel. I guess, let me just play this for you here.
Thinking of taking a road trip to Vegas, be warned. The new MGM hotel there called the Vdara has been found to contain an extra you definitely don't want. It turns out when the sun's rays hit that curved building, it creates a 15-foot wide hotspot on the ground that is so brutal it can burn hair and skin and even melt plastic. Some unlucky hotel guests have been sent running from the pool area after being caught in what hotel employees are calling the death ray, a burning sensation from above. The hotel is rushing to fix the problem.
Okay, so what was happening? So that was a case where, again, think about it, this is a $1 billion building, right? You've got engineers galore that have mapped this out, that have modeled safety and all this other stuff, but it turns out like there's 2 days in the year where the sun is in just a certain position, where between 2 hours of that day, the rays, if it's a bright sunny day, and this is a curved building with a lot of glass, all the light gets focused in on a certain 2x2 area of the pool, right? Or maybe it's a little bit wider area. But the idea is there's so many different possible permutations that you can't possibly think of every single and test every single one. And that's why, again, we no longer use the term safe or unsafe, we rather say conditional, which is that in certain sets of conditions, it's thought to be an acceptable risk. But again, just as this showed you, right, they had to obviously figure out a way to readjust this or say we're going to have to close the pool for these 2 days of the year. But I think you got to recognize that any possible permutation of things that can happen, right, depending upon the patient size, do they have 2 devices? Where exactly is the device? But, so many possible things that you cannot possibly think of. But the way that they do the labeling of these devices nowadays is they do computer modeling, right? Because the idea is that humans, we can't test so many different possible scenarios, but a computer, you can model so many possible different scenarios. So you can model different, sun intensities, different angles of your building, different times of the year where the sun is located, to try to say, okay, is there any regions, any times where there could be potentially at risk? But with modeling, it's not perfect, and you may not always get it, right? So that's why, again, you always have to have an index of suspicion to say, okay, if the patient looks like they're having a problem, and even though it's an MRI conditional device, I got to stop here and take a closer look. All right, so that's the one thing I want everyone to understand when we talk about safety. I mean, this applies to MRI, but really applies to everything. The other question is, if you're trying to figure out, I've got a patient with a certain device, can I get an MRI on this person or not? There's a couple of sources you can go to. One is this website, MRIsafety.com, which kind of has a list of different devices. Or what you can do is go to the particular device's FDA labeling, the package insert, and now FDA requires for most devices that they have a certain labeling as to whether they're MRI unsafe or MRI conditional. And if they're conditional, it'll say what the specific conditions are, right? So for example, like some of these devices here, these transcatheter aortic valves, they're labeled as conditional. Some of them have been tested both at 1.5 and 3 Tesla. Some have been tested at 3 Tesla. Some may have only been tested at 1.5. So again, knowing what the set of conditions are. I mean, the one thing is that the MRI staff, we don't just kind of count on, okay, you guys do the screening and send the patient down. You've said, okay, there's a screening that happens at the MRI lab itself. So the staff will, again, try to make sure we don't miss any of these cases. But it's one of those things you want to, you don't want to have your patient go down for no reason. As a fellow, you can also try to do a screening as well. And again, if it's labeled as MRI conditional, you can, MRI unsafe, you can probably say this person can't be done. Okay. So the other thing also to think about is gadolinium contrast. All right. So gadolinium is an element that is naturally found, but it's a rare earth element. But it turns out that gadolinium has a certain effect on protons, which it causes their rate of relaxation to increase. So it makes the protons, hydrogen atoms, relax at a faster rate. All right? But gadolinium itself is actually toxic, right? So you can't just administer gadolinium to people. That's bad news. So the gadolinium contrast agents that we utilize, they have a chelate attached to them, right? So that the gadolinium molecule is not directly exposed. And it's this gadolinium chelate that you administer, and there's different formulations of these different chelates. So there's different brand names. But the idea, again, is that it's this gadolinium that causes T1 tissue alteration, which allows you to do something like scar imaging, right? Most of you know LGE, right? This is an example of a patient who has an inferior infarct. But again, it's the gadolinium administration that goes to the area of the infarct that allows us to then generate an image like this. So what you need to be aware of, as with any contrast agent, there's potential risk of side effects. So one is an acute allergic reaction. So if you have an allergy to some component, now obviously it's going to be likely an allergy to whatever the chelate is to the gadolinium. There's also a risk of something called nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. And then there's also a question of, is there gadolinium deposition in tissue? So let me kind of go through these. So we talked about the allergy. Again, that's just specific to the chelate. If the patient's allergic, then you don't want to give them gadolinium. The other condition is this thing called nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, which is kind of a fibrosing-like condition. This is an example of somebody who has this nephrogenic systemic fibrosis condition. First case was reported in 1997. Most of the cases, it turned out, were associated with patients who have significant renal insufficiency. And it led to fibrosing of skin and connective tissues throughout the body. And so this can be a very serious condition. All right, the first kind of reported cases of these, or I guess I should say that the first kind of alert that there was a significant number of cases of these, and again, it's still a small percentage, came around 2006 and 7. And at that time, then, the field said, okay, we need to get a better understanding of what's causing this and how do we mitigate this risk. And then what we realized was that, well, it probably has something to do with the chelate that you have and how tightly it's bound to the gadolinium molecules. All right? And so there's two different types of contrast agents. There were those that had a linear chelate. So that means the gadolinium is attached to a linear molecule. And then there's those that had a macrocyclic. Right, so the macrocyclic means like a cage around the gadolinium. So which one do you think tends to have tighter gadolinium binding? It's the one that's the macrocyclic, which has a cage around it. And so one of the things that we've learned now is, and that's why most clinical imaging has shifted from using linear agents to the macrocyclic agents, which completely bind around the gadolinium. So it decreases the chance that the gadolinium molecule can escape and become free. Because again, it's when that gadolinium molecule escapes and becomes free that it could then cause a toxic reaction. So now contrast agents actually have a labeling system where they're labeled as group 1. So it turns out these are the ones that really cause most of the cases of NSF, this nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. So nowadays, most labs no longer use these agents. Then there's the group 2 agents, which most of these are macrocyclic, so that the gadolinium is completely surrounded by a cage. And these, it turns out, the incidence of unconfounded cases of nephrogenic systemic fibrosis is actually very low. And so, part of it was when we initially said, okay, nobody with renal failure should get MRI with contrast. Now the field has shifted again to say you should not get it with these group 1 agents, but now with group 2 agents, which again have a much lower risk, as long as you use a lower dose of gadolinium contrast, even patients with stage 3 or stage 4 CKD or even end-stage renal disease can get an MRI scan if there's a clinical indication for it. And this is just kind of one of the more recent guidelines statements, which talked about the fact that, one, you need to recognize all contrast agents are not the same, and that these group 2 agents have a very low risk of causing complications, and so you should really use those group 2 agents. And that if a patient has a need to get an MRI with contrast, you should not, even if they have renal failure, you should not defer, but you should make sure you use a group 2 contrast agent. But make sure also that you use the lowest dose. And again, the target dose is a 0.1 millimole per kilogram, whereas in the early days we were using 0.2 or even 0.3, so very high doses. So the idea is use low doses of gadolinium contrast, and then there's no need to do dialysis on these patients, okay? So I think from the standpoint of, for the general fellows, what do you need to know is, yes, renal failure is not a contraindication any longer. If you need to do an MRI with contrast and you have a good indication to do it, then it really doesn't matter what their renal failure status is. We just, as a lab, need to know about it, so we make sure we use the optimal contrast agent and we use it in the lowest dose possible. The other thing, though, is there are cases where you may not want to use gadolinium, and that's where there's a good alternative, right? So this is one scenario where I'm showing you, which is if you want just a vascular MRA, right, then there's actually an iron-based agent called ferromoxetol, which actually has the same paramagnetic property. So it causes signal enhancement. And so I'm showing you 2 example cases. One is done with gadolinium. One is done with this iron agent ferromoxetol. Can anybody tell me which is which? How many think this is gadolinium? Raise your hand. Okay. How many think this one is gadolinium? Raise your hand. So we've only got 3 or 4. Most people are abstaining. But it's equally split for the ones that do vote. In fact, this one here is with ferromoxetol. This one here is with gadolinium. Right? You can't really tell the difference. So again, for vascular imaging, this iron-based agent works really well, but it doesn't work for scar imaging because just the properties of it are such that it's not going to concentrate in areas of infarct or scar. Okay, so again, bringing it back to what we'll touch on throughout the rest of the academic year is the different applications for which you can do cardiac MR imaging. But again, it starts with that magnet and those coils that you utilize. And then it starts with many of these applications with using gadolinium-based contrast agents. But then if you have an understanding of how to do this, There's a variety of different applications that you can use, and you can go to the ACC AHA appropriate use criteria to say, what's the role for or for different imaging modalities, and you can see a number of indications where cardiac MRI is considered an appropriate test. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions or comments. Nope, no questions, no comment. Everything's clear cut? All right, great. All right.